Welcome to my channel.
The rain had the decency to arrive gently. It drifted over the hills in thin silver curtains, softening the dark shoulders of the mountains and turning the waters of Black Loch into polished slate. Mist wandered lazily between the pines as though it, too, had no pressing business. In Lochdover, no one hurried unless the church was on fire or the baker announced fresh morning rolls. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth approved of such priorities. He stood beside the river with a fishing rod that regulations might have regarded with suspicion, watching the current slide beneath overhanging alder branches. Officially, he was checking for illegal poachers. Unofficially, he hoped to become one. His old dog, Lugs, lay stretched upon damp grass, opening one eye every so often to make certain his master had not suddenly developed enthusiasm for work. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "We've the right idea." The float trembled. Hamish leaned forward hopefully. A voice drifted across the bank. "I say, you there." The fish escaped. Hamish sighed without moving. It was one of life's smaller tragedies that fish possessed remarkable hearing whenever strangers shouted. Across the footbridge stood Angus Macpherson, postman, amateur philosopher, and full-time collector of village gossip. His waterproof coat flapped like the wings of an irritated crow. "They've been looking for ye. They'll stop. It's headquarters. They'll recover." Angus crossed the bridge anyway. "They say the inspector's been trying to telephone since breakfast." Hamish reeled in his empty hook with exaggerated disappointment. "Perhaps the line's improved." "It has. That's unfortunate." Angus chuckled. Most people from outside the Highlands mistook Hamish Macbeth for a lazy village bobby who preferred fishing to policing. Hamish encouraged the impression. It made life considerably easier. Only a handful of villagers understood that beneath the untidy red hair, sleepy manner, and habit of avoiding paperwork lay a mind forever noticing things other people ignored. It was a useful talent. It was also dangerous. Competence attracted promotion. Promotion meant cities. Cities meant endless traffic. Flats with no gardens, bosses who believed meetings solved everything, and precious little chance of a quiet cup of coffee. Hamish considered all that a fate worse than death. He packed away his rod with theatrical reluctance. "Come on, Lugs." The dog rose with equal reluctance. Together they ambled toward the village. Lochdover sat between sea and mountain, like a secret reluctant to be discovered. White cottages clustered along the narrow road. Fishing boats rocked gently in the harbour. Smoke curled from chimneys despite the mild summer morning. For Highland weather possessed an imagination all its own. Mrs. Wellington, emerging from the village shop with enough groceries to feed an army, spotted Hamish. "Morning, Constable. Morning, busy." Hamish looked thoughtfully at the clouds. "I've been observing atmospheric conditions." "You've been fishing." "I was observing fish," she laughed. Everyone knew, no one minded. The village preferred a policeman who listened more than he shouted. As Hamish approached the hotel, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee escaped through the open windows. That settled the morning's priorities. Inside, the dining room contained 3 tourists arguing over maps, an elderly couple discussing sheep with scholarly intensity, and hotel owner Fiona Ross polishing glasses behind the bar. She looked up. "I've bacon rolls." "I was hoping ye might." And headquarters telephoned. "I was hoping ye wouldn't." She poured coffee without asking. Hamish settled beside the window, grateful for civilization. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside, bacon, coffee, and peace combined into near perfection. It lasted exactly 6 minutes. The sound arrived first. Not thunder, an engine. A large one. Expensive. It rolled into the village with all the subtlety of an opera singer entering a library. Conversation stopped. Curtains twitched. Several locals looked up from their breakfasts with identical expressions of mild disapproval. The vehicle itself gleamed black, despite the rain, absurdly polished against the humble backdrop of fishing cottages. It was the sort of machine designed to impress city businessmen rather than negotiate Highland roads. The driver stepped out. He was tall, perhaps in his early 50s, wearing a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than Hamish earned in several months. His silver hair had been arranged with mathematical precision. He removed driving gloves one finger at a time, looked around the village, and frowned. Not the thoughtful frown of a traveller appreciating scenery. The disappointed frown of a customer inspecting damaged merchandise. "Oh dear," he said loudly enough for several people to hear. "I was told this place had charm." The silence deepened. A Highland village forgave many sins. Arrogance was not among them. Within 15 minutes, the newcomer had managed to offend half the population. He complained about the roads. He complained about mobile reception. He complained about the weather. Most remarkably, he complained about the silence. "It feels," he announced while standing outside the hotel, "rather underdeveloped." Old Donald Fraser, who had lived in Lochda for 83 years, removed his pipe. "Eh? I suppose progress hasn't reached here. It got lost." The Englishman smiled uncertainly. Donald replaced his pipe. Conversation ended. Inside the hotel, Fiona leaned toward Hamish. "Sassenach, I noticed. He's booked the old Black Loch house." Hamish looked up. "No one's lived there properly for years. Apparently, he's bought it. Poor house." The stranger introduced himself before lunch. His name was Julian Faircroft. He explained it several times because nobody had asked. He was, according to himself, a property developer, entrepreneur, investor, and television personality. He intended to transform Black Loch House into what he called an exclusive luxury Highland experience. The phrase circulated through Lochda with the speed usually reserved for escaped livestock. At the harbour, fishermen discussed it darkly. At the shop, customers shook their heads. At the church hall, volunteers decided they disliked the man without requiring further evidence. By afternoon, everyone possessed an opinion. None were favourable. Black Loch House stood 2 miles beyond the village. Once the home of a quietly respected Highland family, it overlooked the loch from a rocky rise, surrounded by ancient Scots pines. Weather had blackened its stone walls until the house seemed almost part of the landscape. Hamish walked there after finishing his coffee. Officially, he wished to welcome the newcomer. Unofficially, curiosity and another excuse to avoid paperwork had drawn him. Lugs trotted ahead. The gates stood open. Several workmen unloaded furniture, while Julian Faircroft directed operations with dramatic impatience. "No, no. The sculpture belongs where people can actually see it." One labourer muttered something under his breath. Another rolled his eyes. Faircroft noticed Hamish. Oh, he looked faintly disappointed. "I expected an inspector." "I'm the village policeman." "Only one." "We've only one village." Faircroft failed to appreciate the remark. "I've already noticed trespassers." "Have ye?" "Locals wandering across my land. They've wandered there for generations. They'll have to stop." Hamish glanced toward an old footpath leading through the woods. "It'll be difficult convincing them. I own the property. I've rights. Yea. They'll obey the law." "They might." The developer smiled thinly. "I understand these places require modernization." Hamish smiled pleasantly in return. "So do some people." Faircroft stared, uncertain whether he had been insulted. Hamish tipped his cap. "If ye need anything, the station's in the village." "I imagine I shan't." "I hope not." He turned away, apparently uninterested. Behind sleepy eyes, however, Hamish had noticed several things. The expensive bronze statue already scratched during unloading. The gardener dismissed after only 10 minutes. The solicitor leaving the house looking distinctly unhappy. And, most curious of all, a young woman standing upstairs behind a curtain. She vanished the instant their eyes met. By evening, the rain had strengthened. Wind crossed Black Loch in long, dark ripples. Back in the police station, Hamish finally answered the telephone. The voice of headquarters barked down the line. "Macbeth, we've been trying to reach you all day. I've been occupied." "Fishing, a community matter." There was an exasperated sigh. You've got some important businessman in your district. Try not to embarrass the force. I'll do my best. I mean it. So do I. The line went dead. Hamish poured himself another mug of coffee. Lugg settled beside the stove with a contented grunt. Outside, rain drummed steadily against the windows. Somewhere across the dark water of Black Loch, lights burned inside the old house where Julian Faircroft had begun making enemies before unpacking his luggage. Hamish looked toward the mist-covered hills. Experience had taught him that people who arrived announcing their importance often brought trouble with them. He only hoped, for once, that the trouble would keep until after the weekend. It did not occur to him that before another sunrise, Black Loch House would become the scene of a death so strange and so humiliating that the quiet village would spend months arguing over it, and his peaceful week would be ruined before it had properly begun. Hamish Macbeth had long ago discovered that the Highlands were never truly silent. Even on nights when the rain swallowed every distant sound, there remained the whisper of pine branches rubbing together, the lonely cry of a curlew over the loch, or the slow lap of black water against stone. A man who listened carefully enough could tell when something belonged and when it did not. That night, lying half awake in his narrow bed above the police station, Hamish heard an engine. He opened one eye. Lugg, sleeping by the stove, raised his head at exactly the same moment. "You're hearing it too," Hamish murmured. The vehicle passed along the road toward Black Loch House. Not quickly, deliberately, the sound faded into the rain. Hamish considered getting up. Instead, he pulled the blanket higher. If every motor car driving after midnight became police business, there would be precious little sleep in Scotland. Besides, whoever it was could scarcely get into much trouble on such a miserable night. Lugg sighed and settled down again. Within minutes, both man and dog were asleep. Morning arrived wrapped in thick grey mist. The rain had stopped, leaving every blade of grass sparkling beneath a reluctant sun. Hamish brewed coffee while frying the last of yesterday's bacon. He had just settled into the first peaceful mouthful when someone hammered on the station door with enough enthusiasm to wake the dead. "I hope," Hamish muttered, "it's no the dead." It was Angus Macpherson. The postman's face had lost its usual cheerful amusement. "They found him." Hamish set down his mug. "Found who?" "The Englishman." Something in Angus's voice answered the question before the words came. "He's dead." Hamish closed his eyes briefly. There goes breakfast. The road to Black Loch had become unusually busy. Villagers stood in discreet little groups, careful not to appear curious while displaying remarkable determination to remain nearby. News travelled in Lochdover faster than electricity. By the time Hamish arrived, half the village already knew someone had died. The other half claimed to know who had done it. Black Loch House looked oddly peaceful beneath the morning mist. The front door stood open. A gardener smoked nervously beside a stone wall. One of yesterday's workmen sat with his head in his hands. Hamish ducked beneath the police tape he had only just begun carrying in the patrol car. The housekeeper hurried toward him. She was a solid woman in her 60s, whose sensible shoes suggested she had survived decades of impossible employers. "Constable Macbeth." I'm Mrs. Porter. You found him? I was bringing tea." Her hands trembled. "I wish I hadn't. Take your time." He wouldn't answer the door. "So, I went round the back." She swallowed. "The greenhouse." She stopped speaking altogether. Hamish nodded gently. "I'll have a look." The greenhouse stood beyond a walled garden overlooking Black Loch. It was old, elegant, and pleasantly warm despite the cool morning. The scent of damp earth mingled with crushed rosemary. A watering can lay on its side. Several flower pots had been smashed. Julian Faircroft lay face first across a potting bench. At first glance, it looked almost comic. His expensive coat had ridden halfway over his back. One polished shoe had fallen off and rested neatly beneath a tomato plant. His immaculate hairstyle had not survived. The comic impression disappeared the instant Hamish walked closer. Faircroft's neck rested at an unnatural angle. Blood had dried beneath one ear. There were bruises across one hand, as though he had tried desperately to seize something before falling. Hamish remained still. He disliked touching anything before looking. People rushed. Objects waited. His eyes traveled slowly around the greenhouse. A broken clay pot. Fresh mud scattered where it ought not to be. One overturned chair. A cracked pane of glass. Nothing remarkable, individually. Together, they whispered of panic. Lugs padded quietly inside. The old dog sniffed once before wandering toward the rear door. Hamish watched. Lugs ignored the body completely. Instead, he stood beside a muddy boot print leading out into the garden. Interesting. Very interesting. Hamish crouched beside the print without touching it. The sole appeared unusually smooth. Not a workman's boot, something more expensive. He stood again. Mrs. Porter waited anxiously outside. Did anyone move him? No. Who saw him first? I did. Anyone else enter? The young lady upstairs came running. The young lady, the secretary. I wasn't told Mr. Faircroft had one. Neither was I. The secretary sat wrapped in a blanket inside the drawing room. She looked barely 30. Dark hair escaped from an untidy knot. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Although Hamish noticed the tears had already dried, she rose automatically. I suppose you're the policeman. I'm Claire Benson. Hamish waited. People disliked silence. Given enough of it, they usually filled it themselves. I only started yesterday. Another silence. He hired me in Inverness. Still, Hamish said nothing. He wanted someone to organize appointments. She looked toward the window. I heard shouting last night. What time? I don't know. Who was shouting? Mr. Faircroft. Anyone else? I couldn't hear. What were they arguing about? I don't know. Again, she hesitated. It sounded personal. Hamish nodded. Did ye look outside? I was frightened. That, he thought, was probably true. Not necessarily the whole truth. Outside, the gardener had regained enough confidence to complain. I told him. Told him what? Hamish asked. Not to cut down those pines? Why? The gardener stared. They're older than the house. Hamish smiled faintly. Trees don't usually murder people. No. The gardener lowered his voice. But folk might. Apparently, Mr. Faircroft had announced plans to remove the old woodland for luxury holiday cabins. He had also intended to close the public footpath crossing the estate and fence off part of the loch. Hamish listened without interruption. Every sentence added another enemy. The list was becoming impressive. By 10:30, the piece shattered. A familiar rover skidded into the driveway. The driver's door burst open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged like an angry storm cloud wearing a badly tailored suit. His face already glowed crimson. 3 detectives hurried behind him, carrying notebooks they would scarcely use. Blair spotted Hamish. You. Morning, sir. What have you managed to ruin? I've mostly been looking. You've been interfering. I only arrived. Blair ignored the correction. He marched into the greenhouse, remained inside less than 30 seconds, then marched out again. Murder. I knew that before I came. So did Angus. Blair glared. Don't be clever. I wouldn't dream of it. Blair jabbed a finger toward the house. English businessman. Wealthy? Outsider. Local resentment. Simple. Hamish remained politely expressionless. I'll wager half this miserable village wanted him dead. Quite possibly. So we begin with whoever hated him most. Hamish looked toward the gardener. The old man immediately became Blair's target. You? The gardener blinked. You threatened him? I said he'd regret cutting trees. There? Blair announced triumphantly. A threat. The detectives scribbled obediently. Hamish looked out across Black Loch instead. The water lay perfectly still beneath the clearing sky. Somewhere, a raven called. He thought again about the muddy footprint, the missing shoe, the bruised hand, the shattered flower pots, and something else, something that refused to settle comfortably in his mind. He walked back into the greenhouse alone. Faircroft's body had not yet been removed. Hamish studied it once more. The man's expensive wristwatch had stopped, not from damage, from water, curious. He followed the sleeve upward. The cuff of the coat was soaked, only one sleeve. The rest of the clothing remained surprisingly dry. Hamish slowly straightened. If Faircroft had been attacked in the greenhouse, why was only one arm wet? He walked to the rear door. Beyond it, a narrow path descended through dripping grass toward the edge of Black Loch. Someone had gone down there after the rain, and someone had come back. The flattened grass was already beginning to rise again beneath the morning sun. Hamish gazed toward the silent black water. Whatever had happened inside the greenhouse had not begun there. It had begun at the loch. And someone, somewhere in the village, was hoping nobody would notice the difference. The road from the greenhouse wound downhill through wet bracken until it reached the stony shore of Black Loch. Hamish followed it without haste, hands deep in his pockets, giving every appearance of a man taking the morning air rather than investigating a murder. Behind him, DCI Blair's booming voice echoed across the estate as he bullied gardeners, workmen, and anyone unfortunate enough to stand within earshot. That suited Hamish perfectly. People talked more freely when Blair was occupied shouting at someone else. Lugs ranged ahead, nose close to the ground. Halfway down the path, the dog paused beside a patch of flattened reeds. Hamish crouched. The earth was still soft from the night's rain, and several impressions remained clear enough to read. One belonged to Faircroft's polished shoe. The heel was narrow, expensive, and quite unsuited to muddy highland paths. Another print lay partly over it, a heavier tread with smooth soles like the one Lugs had found behind the greenhouse. The owner had been careful, stepping on stones where possible, but care often failed when the ground was wet. Hamish looked toward the water. Black Loch lived up to its name. The surface reflected the dark pines so perfectly that the boundary between forest and water almost disappeared. It was easy to imagine old Highland tales of kelpies dragging travellers beneath its still surface. Faircroft had probably laughed at such stories. Hamish doubted he would laugh at anything again. Near the shoreline, he noticed something caught beneath a cluster of rushes. It was no larger than a matchbox. Using a fallen twig rather than his fingers, he eased it free. A silver cufflink, heavy, expensive. The initials JF were engraved on the front. One fastening had snapped clean off. He slipped it carefully into an evidence envelope from his pocket. "So," he murmured, "you lost this before you reached the greenhouse." Lugs gave a quiet bark farther along the shore. Hamish joined him. The dog stood beside an old wooden rowing boat, pulled halfway onto the bank. Dew covered most of it, but one section of the gunwale had been wiped clean, as though someone had steadied themselves there only hours earlier. Hamish rested a hand on the boat. Still, damp, recently used. He peered into it. Nothing. No oars. No fishing tackle. No rope. Someone had taken care to leave it looking ordinary. Too ordinary. He smiled faintly. People trying to hide something often overdid it. A voice drifted down from the path. "Constable." It was Angus Macpherson, puffing slightly from the walk. "I thought I'd find ye here. What brings ye?" "The village. The whole village. Near enough." Angus lowered his voice. "They've been talking. They generally do. It seems your English gentleman wasn't making many friends." Hamish leaned against the boat. "Tell me." Angus needed little encouragement. By the previous evening, Julian Faircroft had argued with the owner of the village shop over plans to replace it with what he called a proper delicatessen. He had informed the minister that the old kirk blocked the best view from Black Loch House. He had suggested the harbour would be prettier without working fishing boats. At dinner in the hotel, he had laughed openly at Highland traditions, calling them quaint tourist material. And that wasn't all, Angus added. No, he had a visitor. Hamish looked up. What sort of visitor? A woman. Local. I've never seen her before. When? Just after supper. Did anyone speak to her? Angus frowned thoughtfully. Mrs. Wellington did. What did she learn? Only that the woman wasn't pleased about coming. Hamish let that settle. Did she leave? That's the odd thing. Angus scratched his chin. No one remembers seeing her go. Back at Black Loch House, Blair had established himself in the drawing room as though he owned it. Detectives bustled in and out, carrying notebooks, photographs, and boxes. Blair sat behind a polished desk, questioning the secretary. Claire Benson, with all the delicacy of a charging bull. "You expect me to believe," he thundered, "that you heard shouting but never looked outside?" Claire flinched. "I was frightened." "Nonsense. I was. You young women always claim you're frightened." Hamish quietly stepped inside. Blair spotted him instantly. "What are you doing now?" "Listening. I've enough listeners, I dare say." Blair jabbed a finger toward the door. Out, Hamish obediently left. He had learned years earlier that arguing with Blair achieved nothing except prolonging the conversation. Outside, Mrs. Porter was directing cleaners away from the kitchen. She beckoned Hamish over. "I remembered something. It seemed unimportant this morning. It often does. Mr. Faircroft received a letter yesterday." "What sort of letter?" "I don't know." "Who delivered it?" "The post." "Did he read it?" "He opened it in the hall." "And?" Mrs. Porter lowered her voice. "I've never seen a man's face change so quickly." "How?" "He went white." "What did he do?" "He put the letter straight into the fire." Hamish looked toward the cold grate in the drawing room. "You actually saw him burn it?" "I emptied the ashes later." "Was there anything left?" "Only a little corner." "Did you keep it?" She looked embarrassed. "I thought it untidy." "You threw it away." "I'm afraid so." Hamish smiled kindly. "You've no way of knowing it mattered." "No, but I think it did." The workmen had gathered near their van, eager for a reason to stop working. One of them, a young electrician named Robbie Kerr, removed his cap as Hamish approached. "Constable." "Morning." Robbie shifted uneasily. "I didn't tell that inspector everything." "No." He wasn't really asking. "What didn't you tell him?" "I stayed later than the others." "How late?" "Maybe 9:30. "What were you doing? Packing tools?" "Did you see Mr. Faircroft?" "Aye. Alone." "Not exactly." Hamish waited. Robbie glanced toward the house before speaking. "He was arguing with someone beside the lock, a man." "I couldn't tell." "Why not?" "It was dark." "What could you hear?" "Only one sentence." "What sentence?" Robbie repeated it carefully. "You should have stayed buried." The words lingered between them. Hamish felt a slight chill, despite the mild afternoon. That was an unusual thing to say during an ordinary quarrel. "Who said it?" "I don't know." "Faircroft." "I couldn't swear." "Did you hear anything else?" "A splash." "A splash." "Aye. I thought someone had slipped into the water." "What happened then?" "The voices stopped. And about 10 minutes later, I saw Mr. Faircroft walking back toward the greenhouse." "Alone?" "I think so." "You aren't certain?" "No." Hamish thanked him and wandered away, appearing no more interested than before. Inside, however, the pieces had begun to move. Faircroft had gone willingly to the loch. Someone had met him there. A struggle, or at least a confrontation, had taken place. There had been a splash, yet the victim had walked back toward the greenhouse alive, which meant the murder itself had happened afterward, unless Hamish stopped walking. Unless everyone had assumed the greenhouse was the place where the attack began, simply because that was where the body had been found. He looked back toward the dark windows of the old glass house. The killer had wanted the police to focus on broken flower pots, scattered soil, and a bent potting bench. A very neat little scene, perhaps. Just perhaps. It was a scene that had been arranged. Hamish did not go back to the greenhouse immediately. If it had been arranged, it would still be arranged in half an hour. There was no point rushing toward evidence that had waited all night. Instead, he wandered into the village. Anyone watching would have concluded that Constable Macbeth had abandoned the investigation in favor of a leisurely stroll. Two elderly ladies nodded to him outside the post office, and he stopped long enough to admire Mrs. Grant's roses before continuing toward the hotel. The smell of fresh scones reached him before he opened the door. "You're just in time." Fiona Ross called from behind the counter. Or perhaps terribly late. For what? Lunch. I was hoping it might be breakfast. She laughed and set a pot of coffee in front of him without asking. You look as though you've forgotten to eat. I've been distracted by murder. It has a way of interrupting the day. Only 2 visitors occupied the dining room now, both whispering over maps they no longer pretended to read. Every few moments, one glanced toward Hamish, evidently disappointed that Scotland's most unhurried policeman did not resemble the detectives from television. Fiona placed a warm scone beside his coffee. I've something you might want to know. So Angus told me. This wasn't for Angus. Hamish buttered the scone. I'm listening. The Englishman had supper here yesterday evening. I know. He wasn't alone for long. Hamish looked up. Who joined him? A gentleman? Local? No. What did he look like? Mid-40s, perhaps, dark hair, well-dressed. The sort of man who smiles without meaning it. Hamish nodded. What did they talk about? I couldn't hear much. You heard something? Fiona folded a tea towel thoughtfully. They were arguing about money. Did voices get raised? Not at first, and afterward, the other man stood up rather suddenly. What happened then? He leaned across the table. She frowned, remembering. I distinctly heard him say, You promised it was destroyed. Hamish stopped spreading butter. Destroyed? That's exactly the word. What did Faircroft say? Nothing stays buried forever. Hamish's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The second time that day he had heard someone mention something being buried. Coincidence? Possibly. He had long ago learned that coincidences deserved polite suspicion. What became of the visitor? He paid for neither meal. So Faircroft paid. Grumbling all the while. Did the visitor leave alone? Yes. Which direction? Toward the harbour. And nobody knew him. No one, I've asked. Hamish thanked her, finished the last of his coffee, and strolled outside. The village appeared perfectly ordinary. Children chased one another along the waterfront. A fisherman repaired nets. Mrs. Wellington carried enough shopping to sink a small boat. Only the clusters of villagers, speaking in lowered voices, betrayed that death had arrived in Lochduff. Near the harbour, Hamish found Willie Lamont mending lobster pots. Willie possessed the remarkable gift of noticing everything, while appearing to notice nothing. Fine afternoon, Hamish said. It'll rain. Probably. Willie continued tying knots. Looking for something. Maybe someone? The Englishman's visitor? Hamish smiled faintly. The news travels quickly. It doesn't travel. Willie jerked his head toward the village. It lives here. Hamish crouched beside him. Did you see the visitor? I did. What time? About 8. What was he doing? Standing on the pier. Waiting. For whom? I'd guess Faircroft. Did they meet? No. What happened? Willie pointed toward the loch. A woman came instead. Hamish remained silent. She wasn't happy. What makes you say that? She slapped him. Hard. I heard it from 20 yards away. And then they argued. What about? I couldn't hear. How long? 5 minutes. Did anyone leave together? No. The woman walked toward Black Loch house, and the man? He drove away. What sort of car? A silver saloon. Registration. Willie grinned. I mend lobster pots, Hamish. I know the licensing office. As Hamish walked back toward the station, another piece quietly settled into place. A mysterious woman. An unknown businessman. Arguments about money. References to something buried. A letter burned in the fireplace. None of it yet explained why Julian Faircroft had ended up dead in his own greenhouse. But it suggested his arrival in Lochduff had not been as spontaneous as he claimed. He had come expecting someone, or perhaps fearing someone. The piece lasted until Blair's car screeched to a halt outside the police station. The detective climbed out, waving a notebook triumphantly. Macbeth. Hamish looked up from cleaning Lug's water bowl. Aye, sir. We've got him. Have ye? The murderer. That was quick. It wasn't difficult. Blair puffed out his chest. The gardener confessed. Hamish blinked. He confessed. He admitted threatening Faircroft. That's no, quite the same thing. He also admitted being near the greenhouse. So was I. Blair ignored him. The fellow lost his temper. Simple. Did he say he killed him? He didn't deny it strongly enough. Hamish regarded his superior for a long moment. That's an unusual legal standard. Blair's face deepened another shade of crimson. You always think you're clever. No. You've been filling these villagers' heads with nonsense. I've mostly been drinking coffee. Blair snorted. You can drink all the coffee you like. The case is finished. He climbed back into his car and drove away towards Strathbane, undoubtedly to report another swift success. Hamish watched the dust settle. Lug sat beside him, tail thumping lazily against the step. What do you think? Hamish asked. The dog yawned. So do I. That evening, Hamish returned alone to Black Loch House. Most of Blair's officers had already left, satisfied that the murderer sat in custody. The estate lay almost deserted. The greenhouse glowed faintly in the last light of sunset. Hamish entered quietly. Nothing had changed. The broken flower pots remained exactly where the forensic photographer had left them. The overturned chair still leaned against the bench. He stood over the place where Faircroft's body had been found. Then he did something Blair never bothered to do. He sat down. For nearly 15 minutes, he remained perfectly still. He imagined Faircroft entering the greenhouse. He imagined someone following. He pictured the struggle. Something refused to fit. Finally, his eyes drifted upward. The greenhouse roof was made almost entirely of old glass panes. Most were streaked with rain. One panel, directly above the potting bench, was spotless, too spotless, as though it had been cleaned recently. Hamish slowly stood. He stepped onto the overturned chair and reached toward the metal support beneath the clean pane. His fingers brushed against something rough. Not metal, twine, very thin, almost invisible. He pulled gently. A length of fishing line slipped free, trailing down from the roof beams. At its end hung a tiny brass hook. Hamish stared at it. It was an absurd thing to find in the middle of a murder investigation, unless he looked down at the exact spot where Faircroft had fallen. Then, back at the nearly invisible fishing line, a faint smile appeared beneath his red moustache. Well now, he murmured to the empty greenhouse, that's clever. The killer had not merely staged the crime. The killer had built the stage itself. And somewhere in Lochtabuff lived a person patient enough, practical enough, and familiar enough with knots and fishing line to devise a trick that would fool almost everyone. Almost everyone, but not a Highland constable who had spent half his life watching fishing tackle disappear into the water. Hamish carefully wound the length of fishing line around a pencil before slipping it into an evidence envelope. He resisted the temptation to tug at the remaining strands fixed to the greenhouse roof. Whatever the arrangement had been, disturbing it now might destroy the very clue that explained it. He stepped down from the chair and stood where Julian Faircroft's body had been found. The brass hook had hung almost directly above the potting bench. Too high to catch a man by accident, too carefully positioned to serve any ordinary gardening purpose. Hamish let his eyes travel slowly around the greenhouse again. There, a small iron ring had been screwed into the wooden frame beside the rear door. Old, weathered, but polished recently, something had passed through it, something like fishing line. He followed the invisible path in his mind, a line from the roof, through the iron ring, out into the garden. His gaze continued toward the loch. Someone could have stood outside, hidden by shrubs, pulling the line. Not to kill, to move something, or distract someone. He smiled faintly. You're making this unnecessarily complicated, he said to the absent murderer. The following morning dawned bright enough to fool tourists into believing Highland summers were dependable. By 9 o'clock, Lochtabuff had returned to its customary rhythm. Fishing boats left the harbour. Children cycled noisily along the main street. Mrs. Wellington had already acquired 3 conflicting versions of the murder and was confidently repeating all of them. Hamish wandered into the village shop. The bell above the door jingled. Inside, shelves overflowed with everything from oatcakes to engine oil. Mrs. McLean stood behind the counter, knitting with astonishing speed despite serving customers. Morning, Hamish. Morning. You've come for coffee. I've come for gossip. That's more expensive. She nodded toward the biscuit tin. 2 shortbread. Hamish obediently paid the price. Mrs. McLean accepted this as entirely reasonable. I heard your Englishman had visitors before he died. So did I. You haven't heard about the telephone. Hamish looked interested. What telephone? He was forever complaining about the signal. I noticed. So he used ours. When? Yesterday afternoon. What for? He made 2 calls. Did you hear anything? I wasn't trying to. She paused. But one sentence rather carried. What sentence, if she's found it? We're all finished. Hamish broke off a piece of shortbread. We're all finished, he said. Mrs. McLean nodded. He sounded frightened. Not angry. No, frightened. That was different. Julian Faircroft struck Hamish as a man who preferred causing fear to feeling it. If he had truly been afraid, then something had happened before he ever reached Lochdabuff. As Hamish stepped outside, Elspeth Grant nearly collided with him. The young journalist balanced a camera around her neck and a notebook beneath one arm. You've been avoiding me. I've been working. She raised an eyebrow. That's your excuse. It seemed worth trying. Elspeth laughed. She had known Hamish long enough to distinguish genuine laziness from deliberate appearances. The newspapers are calling it the Black Loch murder already. They're optimistic. They're also wrong. In what way? They're saying Faircroft came here to buy holiday property. Hamish watched her carefully. And I checked. You checked? I spoke to someone in Inverness. What did they tell you? Faircroft bought Black Loch House 6 months ago. Hamish frowned. 6 months? He only moved in yesterday. That's a long delay. Exactly. Elspeth lowered her voice. Whatever brought him to Lochdabuff wasn't buying the estate. It brought him back, she smiled. I thought you'd notice. Hamish had. He simply hadn't said it aloud. People rarely waited half a year to occupy a newly purchased Highland mansion, unless something had delayed them. Or someone had. By midday, Blair returned, looking unusually pleased with himself. The Crown Office is delighted, he announced to anyone willing or unwilling to listen. The gardener's being formally questioned. Hamish sipped his coffee. Has he confessed yet? He will. That's convenient. Blair ignored the remark. We've established motive. You have? He hated Faircroft. So did most of the village. He threatened him. So did the weather. Blair slammed a file onto Hamish's desk. I don't know why headquarters tolerates you. Hamish looked mildly puzzled. I expect they keep hoping I'll improve. You won't? I quite agree. Blair stormed out again, muttering darkly. Luggs watched him leave before looking hopefully at Hamish. I know, Hamish said. He's exhausting. Late that afternoon, Hamish decided to visit the gardener in custody. Malcolm Fraser sat alone in the small interview room at Strathbane Police Headquarters. He looked more bewildered than frightened. I never killed him, Malcolm said before Hamish had even sat down. I know. They're saying I confessed. You admitted threatening him. I threatened to report him to the council. That's not quite murder. Malcolm rubbed tired eyes. He wanted every pine on that hill cut down. I heard. He said they'd spoil the view from his luxury lodges. Hamish remained silent. After a moment, Malcolm leaned forward. There is something I didn't tell that inspector. No, I was ashamed. What of? I was spying. Hamish smiled. You're in good company. Most villages do. I followed Faircroft last night. To the loch? Malcolm nodded. I hid behind the old boathouse. What did you see? Faircroft met someone. A man or woman? A woman? The same one from the harbour? I think so. What happened? They argued. About what? I couldn't hear. Then they both walked toward the water. And Malcolm hesitated. I heard another voice. Hamish looked up sharply. A third person? Aye. Did you see them? No. They stayed hidden in the trees. What happened next? The woman screamed. Hamish waited. Then there was a splash. And after that, Silence. Where did the woman go? I never saw. Faircroft? He walked back toward the greenhouse. Alone? I think so. You keep saying you think. Malcolm spread his hands helplessly. It was dark. Hamish believed him. The old gardener had no talent for lying. Liars tended to improve their stories with every telling. Malcolm's became less certain each time. That usually meant he was trying honestly to remember. Driving back to Lochduff, Hamish slowed beside Black Loch. The water reflected the evening sky like polished glass. 3 people, not 2. Someone had remained hidden among the trees while Faircroft argued with the mysterious woman. Someone who never came forward. Someone who perhaps had not wanted to be seen at all. He parked beside the old boathouse and walked into the pines. The ground here was softer than near the shore. Pine needles covered most footprints, but years of stalking deer had taught Hamish to notice disturbed earth. A broken fern, fresh bark scraped from a trunk, one snapped twig at shoulder height. He stopped. Wedged into the rough bark was a tiny shred of dark blue fabric, no larger than a thumbnail. He eased it free carefully. Not gardening clothes, not Faircroft's camel-colored coat. A fine wool, probably from an expensive jacket. Hamish slipped it into another envelope. Then he noticed something else. Carved into the weathered side of the boathouse, almost hidden beneath moss, were 2 letters. A.B. The cuts were old. Years old. Someone had stood there long before Julian Faircroft ever arrived in Lochduff. Hamish rested a hand against the rough timber. "Who are you?" he murmured. The initials meant nothing to him. Not yet. But they had the uncomfortable feeling of belonging to the past. And if there was one thing every village possessed in abundance, it was a past that people preferred to leave buried. The more Hamish uncovered, the less he believed Julian Faircroft had come to the Highlands to build luxury cottages. He had come looking for something connected to Black Loch decades earlier. Something important enough that at least 3 people had met him by the water on the night he died. And something dangerous enough that one of them had decided Julian Faircroft would never leave Lochduff alive. Hamish kept the scrap of blue wool in his pocket, all the way back to the village. It was hardly dramatic evidence, but he had solved enough murders to know that tiny things often carried the greatest weight. A broken button, a lie about a dog, a pair of muddy boots left outside the wrong cottage. Small details had a habit of exposing very large secrets. The evening air smelled of peat smoke as he stopped outside the police station. Lugs bounded up the steps ahead of him, stopping only when he noticed a familiar Land Rover parked across the street. Priscilla Halberton Smythe climbed out, dressed in a waxed jacket and muddy riding boots. She looked as though she had come directly from the estate. "I heard," she said before Hamish could speak. "Everyone has. I thought you might need coffee." She held up a small basket. Hamish smiled. "Now, that's true friendship. It also contains sandwiches." "I may have to marry you after all," she laughed. "You've been saying that for years, and wisely avoiding the consequences." Inside the station, Priscilla unpacked the basket, while Hamish filled the kettle. She watched him in silence for a moment. "You're thinking?" "I generally try." "No," she smiled knowingly. "You're pretending not to." That was closer to the truth. Hamish had spent most of the drive home arranging facts in his mind. Julian Faircroft had purchased Black Loch House 6 months earlier, but delayed moving in. He had received a letter that frightened him enough to burn it. He had met at least 2 visitors, and probably 3 on the evening of his death. Someone had spoken repeatedly about something being buried, and now there were mysterious initials carved into an old boathouse. Priscilla interrupted his thoughts. Who owned Black Loch House before Faircroft? The McAllister family. They sold it willingly. So far as I know. She buttered a slice of bread. You should find out. Hamish looked at her. Why? Because old Highland families rarely sell ancestral homes unless they have no choice. It was such a simple observation that he wondered why he had overlooked it. That was one reason he valued Priscilla. She possessed an instinct for the habits of old landed families that he lacked. "You've earned your sandwich," he said. "I know. Yeah, war." The following morning, Hamish drove to the tiny parish library, a stone building that served equally as reading room, archive, and unofficial memory of Lockdove. Miss Morag Sinclair presided over it with the stern efficiency of someone who considered overdue books a moral failing. She peered over her spectacles. "I thought policemen arrested criminals." "We do. You appear to be borrowing history?" "I'm broadening my horizons." She disappeared among the shelves and returned with 3 dusty ledgers. "The estate records. I was hoping you'd have them." "I have everything." Hamish believed her. For the next hour, he worked quietly through faded deeds and parish notes. Black Loch House had indeed belonged to the McAllisters for nearly 2 centuries. The last owner before the sale had been Alexander McAllister. He frowned. There it was, again. Initials. Not AB. The house had been sold only after Alexander's death to Julian Faircroft. Nothing unusual, until Hamish reached an older parish entry tucked into the back of another volume. It was dated nearly 28 years earlier. A brief notice recorded that a local schoolteacher named Andrew Bain had disappeared while walking near Black Loch. Despite extensive searches, no body had ever been recovered. Hamish sat perfectly still. Andrew Bain. AB. The initials carved into the boathouse. Miss Sinclair noticed his expression. "Found something." "Perhaps." "I remember Andrew Bain." Hamish looked up. "You knew him?" "Oh, yes. He taught at the primary school." "What sort of man was he?" "A quiet soul, married." "No, enemies?" she considered. "None that I knew." "What happened?" "The police said he must have drowned." "And did people believe that?" Miss Sinclair closed the ledger gently. "We believed what was easiest." Hamish drove straight to the church. The Reverend Peter McLean was trimming roses outside the manse. "You've picked a fine day for gardening," Hamish observed. "It's God's apology for yesterday." Hamish smiled. "Do you remember Andrew Bain?" The minister rested both hands on his shears. "I do. You conducted the memorial service." "My predecessor did, but you know the story." Peter nodded slowly. "Everyone knew it. Tell me." The minister looked toward Black Loch before speaking. "Andrew Bain wasn't merely the schoolmaster." "No, he was engaged." "To whom?" "Margaret McAllister." Hamish's eyebrows rose. "The daughter of the family at Black Loch House?" "Yes." "What happened?" "The engagement ended suddenly." "Why?" "No one ever explained." "And then?" "Andrew disappeared." The minister sighed. Some whispered that heartbreak drove him into the loch. "You don't believe that?" "No." "What do you believe?" "I believe too many people were relieved when the questions stopped." On the drive back, Hamish's thoughts gathered speed. Andrew Bain. Margaret McAllister. Black Loch House. A disappearance nearly 3 decades old. Faircroft, talking obsessively about something buried. Something destroyed. Something that should have remained hidden. It could all be coincidence, but Hamish had never encountered 6 coincidences standing politely in a row. He found Elspeth Grant waiting outside the station, with a notebook in one hand and an impatient expression on her face. "You've been impossible to find." "I've been reading." "That's even worse." She handed him a folded newspaper clipping. "I found this in the Inverness archives." Hamish unfolded it carefully. The article was nearly 30 years old. Its headline read, "Local teacher missing search of Black Loch continues." Most of the report repeated what he already knew. Then his eyes caught a single paragraph near the bottom. Search volunteers included businessman Charles Faircroft, who was visiting relatives in the district. Hamish read the sentence twice. Then, a third time. "Charles Faircroft, not Julian." "Charles, you've gone quiet," Elspeth observed. Hamish looked up slowly. "Julian's father. You know him?" "I've never met him." But what business had his father searching Black Loch nearly 30 years ago?" Elspeth folded her arms. "I was hoping you'd answer that." Instead, Hamish stared toward the distant hills. The Faircroft name had not arrived in Lockdove 6 months ago. It had been there decades earlier. That changed everything. Because if Charles Faircroft had been connected to Andrew Bain's disappearance, then Julian Faircroft had not come north to begin a new chapter. He had come back to finish an old one. And somewhere in the Highlands, someone had been waiting 28 years for his return. Hamish spent the evening in his kitchen, with the newspaper clipping spread across the table beside the parish records. Lugs lay asleep near the stove, occasionally opening one eye whenever Hamish reached for another biscuit. Outside, rain returned, rattling gently against the windows. Inside, Hamish arranged the facts into two neat columns. The first contained what everyone believed. Julian Faircroft had bought Black Loch House, upset the village, argued with half the county, and been murdered by an angry gardener. The second contained what only Hamish knew. Julian's father, Charles Faircroft, had been in Lochdubuff 28 years earlier when Andrew Bain disappeared. Julian had delayed moving into Black Loch House for 6 months. He had received a letter that frightened him. He had burned it. He had spoken repeatedly about something that should have remained buried. He had met several secret visitors on the night he died. Someone had staged the greenhouse after the murder. The second list was becoming much more interesting than the first. A knock sounded at the station door. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Visitors at that hour usually brought trouble. Hamish opened the door to find Mrs. Porter standing in the rain, clutching a small cardboard box. "I've been thinking," she said nervously. "That's rarely a mistake. I was packing Mr. Faircroft's study. You've been allowed back inside. The inspector released the house this afternoon." She held out the box. "I found these hidden behind a loose drawer." Hamish carried it inside and cleared a place on the table. The box contained old photographs, several envelopes tied with string, and a leather-bound diary. None of them belonged to Julian Faircroft. The diary's cover bore another name, Charles Faircroft. Hamish looked at Mrs. Porter. "Did anyone else see this?" "No, you've told no one. I came straight here. You've done exactly the right thing." She looked relieved. "I thought perhaps it mattered." "I think," Hamish replied quietly, "it may matter a great deal." After Mrs. Porter left, Hamish opened the diary carefully. Most of the entries concerned business meetings, shooting weekends, and investments. Charles Faircroft had been a man who treated life as though it were another company to manage. Then Hamish reached the entries from 28 years earlier. The handwriting changed. The confident script became hurried. One sentence caught his eye immediately. "Returned to Black Loch. Alexander insists the matter is finished." Hamish frowned. "Alexander McAllister, the former owner of Black Loch House." He read on. "Bain refuses to accept the arrangement." Another page. "Margaret has become troublesome." Then several pages had been torn out. Not one or two, nearly a week's worth. Someone had removed them carefully with a blade. Hamish turned another page. The first intact entry afterward read, "Everything is finally quiet." He closed the diary, not because he had finished reading, because he suddenly wanted very much to know what had been written on the missing pages. The following morning, Hamish drove to Strathbane, not to see Blair. He had no desire to spoil an otherwise pleasant day. Instead, he visited Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson. Unlike Blair, Anderson possessed both patience and common sense. He welcomed Hamish with a mug of tea. "What brings you here? I need a favor." "I was afraid of that." Hamish laid the newspaper, clipping on the desk. Charles Faircroft. Anderson adjusted his glasses. "The businessman. I want to know everything. Dead these 10 years. I know." "What sort of everything?" "Business partners, family, old police files, financial trouble?" "Anything connecting him to Black Loch." Anderson whistled softly. "That's a tall order. I've coffee waiting back in Lochduff. You drive a hard bargain." By late afternoon, Anderson telephoned. "I've found something." Hamish leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening." Charles Faircroft wasn't simply visiting relatives. No, he was negotiating to buy part of the McAllister estate. Did he? No. Why not? The sale collapsed. What happened? No one recorded the reason, and there was another interesting name. Hamish waited. Andrew Bain. What about him? He publicly objected to the sale. Hamish sat upright, publicly. There was a council meeting. Why, object. He claimed ancient public footpaths would be closed. Hamish smiled faintly. History, it seemed, had a habit of repeating itself. Julian Faircroft had arrived with exactly the same plans. Holiday lodges, closed footpaths, private land, almost word for word. What happened after the meeting? Hamish asked. Anderson shuffled papers. Nothing official and unofficial. A week later, Andrew Bain disappeared. That evening, Hamish walked alone along the shore of Black Loch. The water reflected the crimson sunset. Somewhere across the loch, a stag called. He stood beside the old boathouse, studying the initials carved into the timber. A.B. Andrew Bain, not the work of a schoolteacher idly passing time. The carving had been made with care, almost lovingly. Someone had wanted those initials to remain, perhaps as a promise, perhaps as a memory, or perhaps because two people had carved them together. His eyes wandered toward Black Loch House. Margaret McAllister had been engaged to Andrew Bain. Had she carved them? Had they stood here, planning a future that never arrived? He was so absorbed in thought that he almost missed the sound behind him. A twig snapped, not loudly, just enough. Hamish turned. Nothing. The pines stood perfectly still. He waited, silence. Most people would have dismissed it. Hamish did not. Someone had been watching him. He walked casually toward the path, giving every impression of abandoning the search. Instead of climbing directly to the road, he slipped quietly behind a stand of gorse and waited. 2 minutes passed, then 3. Finally, a figure emerged from the trees. Tall, wearing a dark blue jacket, the very color of the wool fragment Hamish had found snagged on the bark. The stranger moved cautiously to the boathouse, looked around, then knelt beside the weathered wall. Hamish watched as the figure reached into the moss and removed something hidden beneath a loose stone, a small metal tin. The stranger opened it briefly. Whatever lay inside seemed to satisfy them. They closed the tin and slipped it into a coat pocket. Hamish began to move. A boot scraped against gravel. The figure's head jerked around. For one frozen second, they stared directly at each other. The face remained hidden beneath the shadow of a waterproof hood. Then, the stranger bolted. They sprinted through the trees with surprising speed. Hamish gave chase. Branches whipped against his face as he ran between the pines. The fleeing figure knew the woodland well. Cutting sharply between boulders and fallen trunks, lugs burst from the path ahead, barking furiously. The stranger changed direction at once. Too late. Their shoulder struck a low branch with a crack. Something flew from a pocket and landed among the ferns. But the runner never slowed. Within seconds, they disappeared into the deepening dusk beyond the trees. Hamish stood listening. Only the wind answered. Lugs trotted back proudly, tail wagging. Nearly, Hamish said, scratching the dog's ears. Very nearly. He searched the ground where the object had fallen. Half buried beneath damp leaves lay an old silver locket. The clasp had sprung open during the fall. Inside were 2 tiny photographs. One showed a smiling young woman Hamish immediately recognized from the faded portrait hanging in Black Loch House, Margaret McAllister. The second photograph showed a young man standing beside her with one arm around her shoulders. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were 4 words. Andrew, always, whatever happens. Hamish closed the locket slowly. The murderer, or someone protecting the murderer, had just tried to recover a keepsake hidden for nearly 3 decades, which meant the past was no longer merely connected to Julian Faircroft's death. The past was the reason for it. Hamish slipped the locket into his pocket, with the same care one might use for a rare bird's egg. It was not merely sentimental. Someone had returned to the boathouse after nearly 3 decades to retrieve it. That made it evidence he looked once more into the darkness where the stranger had disappeared. There was little point in chasing farther. A frightened person ran faster than a determined policeman, especially through woods they knew well. Lugs sniffed around the loose stone where the tin had been hidden, then sneezed. Nothing left. The dog wagged his tail. So they took everything. Not quite everything, Hamish thought. They had left behind the one thing that mattered most. Proof that Andrew Bain and Margaret McAllister had shared more than a passing acquaintance. The next morning dawned bright and windy. The clouds raced over the mountains, casting moving shadows across Black Loch. Hamish drove to Black Loch House before breakfast. Most of Blair's officers had disappeared, convinced the case was all but closed. Only one bored constable remained to keep watch over the property. Inside, the great house felt emptier than before. Mrs. Porter was dusting the library. "I've another question," Hamish said. "I was expecting one." He smiled. "Do you remember a silver locket she stopped polishing? Margaret's, you know it? Everyone did. What became of it?" Mrs. Porter looked toward the window. "It vanished. When?" "The same week Andrew Bain disappeared." Hamish took the locket from his pocket and opened it. Mrs. Porter gasped. "I haven't seen that since I was a girl. So it belonged to Margaret?" "It was never off her neck." "What happened after Andrew disappeared?" Mrs. Porter's face clouded. "Her father forbade anyone to mention him. And Margaret. She changed. In what way?" "She stopped laughing." "Did she remain at Black Loch House for another year? And then she went away? Where?" "No one knew." Mrs. Porter hesitated. "There were rumors." "What sort of rumors?" "Some said London. Others, Canada." "And what did you believe?" "I believe she was running from something." Hamish wandered into the old drawing room. A row of portraits lined one wall. Generations of McAllisters stared down with varying degrees of sternness. Margaret's portrait hung near the end. She looked no older than 23, dark-haired, bright-eyed. There was an unmistakable warmth in her smile, not the smile of someone raised to think herself above other people. Hamish studied the painting closely. Something caught his attention. Her neck? The artist had painted a fine silver chain disappearing beneath the collar of her dress. The locket, the same one now resting in Hamish's pocket, which meant the portrait had been painted before Andrew Bain disappeared. A voice behind him broke the silence. "I wondered when someone would notice." Hamish turned. An elderly woman stood in the doorway. She leaned lightly on a walking stick, but held herself with quiet dignity. Her silver hair was neatly pinned. Her eyes remained remarkably sharp. "I'm sorry," Hamish said. "I don't believe we've met." "You haven't," she smiled faintly. "My name is Eleanor McAllister." Hamish felt a small jolt. The sister. "My younger sister was Margaret." He gestured toward the portrait. "I was just looking at her." "So I see." She walked slowly into the room. "You found the locket." Hamish did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "How did you know?" "Because if you hadn't, you wouldn't be standing in front of that painting." They sat together in the library over coffee. Unlike most people Hamish interviewed, Eleanor McAllister did not appear nervous. She appeared tired. "The police asked the wrong questions 28 years ago," she said quietly. "They assumed Andrew Bain drowned." "What did you assume?" "I assumed he didn't." "Why?" "Because Margaret never believed it." "Did she tell you so?" "Every day." Eleanor folded her hands. She insisted Andrew was alive. "For how long?" "Months, and afterward." She stopped saying he was alive. Hamish looked up. "What changed?" "She began saying someone had killed him." The room fell silent. "Did she name anyone?" Hamish asked. "No. Why not?" "She said she had no proof, but she suspected someone." Eleanor nodded. "My father." Hamish remained perfectly still. "Alexander McAllister." "Yes." "And Charles Faircroft?" The names hung heavily in the room. "My father and Charles Faircroft met secretly several times before Andrew vanished." "What about?" "I was never told. But Margaret knew. I think she overheard something." "Did she ever say what?" "No. Only one sentence." "What sentence?" Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "If they ever dig beside the old boathouse, everything will come out." Hamish's pulse quickened. Dig, buried. The boathouse. The same place where someone had hidden the tin. The same place where Andrew Bain's initials were carved. The same place where Julian Faircroft had gone on the night he died. Hamish excused himself and drove directly to the boathouse. The wind had strengthened. Small waves slapped against the weathered timbers. He stood, looking at the ground, around the wall. If Eleanor remembered correctly, something had been buried here for nearly 30 years. But where? The area had been searched countless times after Andrew Bain disappeared. Unless he walked slowly around the building. Most of the foundations rested on solid rock. One corner did not. A narrow strip of earth lay between the wall and a cluster of old gorse bushes. The soil there looked oddly uneven, not freshly disturbed, simply different. Lugs began scratching enthusiastically. "What have you got?" The dog pawed at the ground until something hard produced a dull metallic sound. Hamish knelt. Using only his pocket knife, he carefully scraped away loose soil. Within moments, the blade struck rusted iron, a box, small, no larger than a biscuit tin. His heartbeat quickened. He lifted it free. The lock had long since rotted away. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric crumbled at his touch. Beneath it rested a leather folder tied with faded ribbon. Hamish untied it carefully. Old papers, letters, several photographs, and, folded separately, a map of the Black Loch estate. One section had been marked in red pencil. The shoreline near the boathouse. Across the top, someone had written a single sentence in Andrew Bain's unmistakably careful handwriting. "Evidence if anything happens to me." Hamish stared at the words. He had not found treasure. He had found a dead man's insurance policy. And if Andrew Bain had hidden evidence before he disappeared, then Andrew had known his life was already in danger. A car door slammed somewhere up the hill. Hamish looked up sharply. Another vehicle had arrived at Black Loch House. Voices carried on the wind. One of them belonged unmistakably to DCI Blair. The other belonged to a woman, clear, steady, and trembling with controlled anger. Hamish could not yet make out her face. But as she stepped from the car and removed her hat, Eleanor McAllister, standing on the terrace above, whispered a name that had not been spoken in Lochdebuff for nearly 3 decades. "Margaret." Hamish slowly turned toward the house. The woman everyone believed had vanished forever had just returned to Black Loch. For a long moment, Hamish remained where he was, the leather folder still in his hands. Across the estate, the wind carried fragments of voices from the front of Black Loch House. Blair's familiar bellow rose above the rest, followed by the calm reply of the woman Eleanor had recognized, Margaret McAllister. If Eleanor was right, the woman had returned to Lochdebuff after 28 years on the very day Hamish unearthed Andrew Bain's hidden papers. Coincidence had officially exhausted its usefulness. Hamish wrapped the folder once more in the remains of the oilcloth and slipped it carefully into his canvas shoulder bag. He would read every page. But not here, not while half the police force, and perhaps a murderer, stood only a few hundred yards away. The drawing room had become an unlikely battleground. Blair stood in the middle of it, chest puffed out, notebook in hand. Opposite him stood a woman in her early 50s. Time had silvered her dark hair, but it had not diminished the quiet strength in her face. Hamish recognized her immediately from the portrait. Margaret McAllister. She acknowledged him with the slightest nod before returning her attention to Blair. "I have answered that question twice already. I'll ask it a third time," Blair barked. "Where have you been for the last 28 years? In Canada? Doing what?" "Living," Blair frowned, as though this were an unnecessarily vague occupation. "And why return now?" Margaret met his stare without flinching. "Because Julian Faircroft invited me." The room fell silent. Even Blair paused. "He invited you? 3 weeks ago." "Why, he wrote to me." Hamish's thoughts flashed instantly to the burned letter. "Not the one Faircroft had received, the one he had sent," Margaret continued. "He claimed he had discovered something belonging to Andrew Bain." Blair scribbled noisily. "What exactly?" He refused to say. "Convenient. He insisted we speak in person. When did you arrive?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Did you meet him?" "Yes." "Where?" "At the harbour." Hamish and Blair exchanged the briefest glance. So Willie Lamont had indeed seen her. What happened? Blair demanded. We argued about. He wanted money. Blair looked surprised. Money, he said. He possessed documents that would destroy my family's reputation. And unless you paid, he intended to sell them, Hamish said quietly. Blackmail. Margaret turned toward him. Yes, Blair snorted. So you killed him? No, you expected me to believe otherwise. I came to buy my past back. She spoke without emotion. Not to create another tragedy. Blair dismissed her statement with theatrical disbelief and ordered a detective to remain with her. The moment he left the room, Hamish quietly approached. I'm Hamish Macbeth. I know. Eleanor recognized you. A shadow crossed Margaret's face. How is she? She remembers? Margaret smiled sadly. That has always been both her blessing and her burden. Hamish lowered his voice. Did Julian really have something belonging to Andrew Bain? Margaret looked at him for several seconds before answering. I think he did. What? I don't know. But you suspected, she nodded. My father's papers? The same papers Charles Faircroft wanted. Again, she nodded. Hamish decided to risk one more question. Did Andrew Bain drown? Margaret looked out toward Black Loch. No. The answer came so quietly he almost missed it. He never reached the water. That evening, after Blair had finally departed for Strathbane with promises of an imminent arrest, Hamish sat alone in the police station and untied the faded ribbon around Andrew Bain's leather folder. The first document was a survey map of the Black Loch estate. Nothing unusual. The second was a series of handwritten notes. Andrew's writing was careful and methodical. Alexander McAllister and Charles Faircroft intend to sell the eastern woodland, despite legal protections. Another page, survey markers deliberately moved. Another, public access records, altered. Hamish frowned. Land fraud, serious enough, but hardly worth murder. Then he reached the final bundle. Letters. Most were between Alexander McAllister and Charles Faircroft. One sentence appeared again and again. The mineral survey must remain confidential. Hamish sat upright. Mineral survey. He searched farther. Near the bottom of the bundle lay a folded government report. Its cover read, Geological Assessment, Black Loch Estate. He skimmed the first pages until one paragraph caught his attention. Deposits of exceptionally pure, rare earth minerals had been identified beneath sections of the eastern woodland. Hamish stopped reading. Rare earth minerals, worth fortunes. Suddenly, everything changed. Holiday lodges, luxury developments, estate purchases. None of them had ever been the true objective. The land itself had been priceless. Andrew Bain had discovered the survey. Charles Faircroft and Alexander McAllister had wanted it hidden. Julian Faircroft had inherited far more than his father's business. He had inherited his father's secret. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Jimmy Anderson. I thought you'd still be awake. I usually am. Anderson noticed the papers spread across the table. I've brought something. What? A file that should interest you. He placed an old police folder beside the geological report, the original missing person investigation. Hamish opened it. Most of the statements were routine. Volunteers, search parties, weather reports. Then he found an interview with Charles Faircroft. One answer made him freeze. Question. When did you last see Andrew Bain? Answer around 7:30 inches the evening near the greenhouse. Hamish looked slowly toward the window. The greenhouse. Not the boathouse. The greenhouse, nearly 30 years earlier. He reached for another statement. Alexander McAllister had also claimed to meet Andrew Bain. Near the greenhouse, not by the loch. Hamish leaned back. The greenhouse again. Just as Julian Faircroft's body had been found there. Just as the elaborate fishing line mechanism had been staged there. The murderer had chosen that location for a reason. Not convenience. Memory. Someone had deliberately recreated the last place Andrew Bain had been seen alive. Jimmy Anderson watched Hamish's expression. What have you found? Hamish answered slowly. I think. He tapped the old police file. Our killer wasn't simply trying to hide a murder. He tapped the recent case photographs from the greenhouse. They were sending a message. A message to whom? Hamish looked toward Black Loch House, where a single upstairs window still glowed against the darkness, to the only people who would understand it. He gathered the old file, Andrew Bain's papers, and the new evidence into a single pile. At last, the scattered pieces of two mysteries, one nearly 3 decades old and one only days old, had begun to fit together. The motive was no longer just revenge, it was justice delayed. And the person who had killed Julian Faircroft wanted someone to know exactly why. Hamish slept badly, not because of the case, because it had finally become simple. The best murders, he had often reflected, were never complicated. People made them complicated afterward, by lying, hiding, embellishing, and convincing themselves they had acted for noble reasons. The truth, when it arrived, usually proved painfully human. By dawn, he had decided exactly what to do: not arrest anyone. Not yet. He would let the killer reveal themselves. The following afternoon, Hamish wandered into the hotel dining room with studied laziness, carrying a mug of coffee. Fiona Ross raised an eyebrow. "You look pleased. I've reached the dangerous stage." "Which is?" "I think I know what happened. And I've no intention of telling anyone." Within the hour, the remark had travelled through Lochtabuff. By tea-time, it had reached the harbour. By supper, it had undoubtedly reached the murderer. That was precisely the point. Hamish then paid a seemingly casual visit to Margaret McAllister. She sat in the drawing-room of Black Loch House, the portrait of her younger self, watching silently from the wall. "I've found Andrew Bain's papers," Hamish said. Margaret closed her eyes. So he managed to hide them. He expected something to happen. He knew. You knew as well. She nodded sadly. Andrew discovered the geological survey before anyone else. The rare earth deposits. Yes, my father intended to sell the land quietly to Charles Faircroft, so the fortune would belong to them. They altered boundaries, concealed reports, and prepared contracts before anyone else knew what lay beneath the hills. And Andrew? He found the original survey while helping organize parish records. He threatened to expose them. He said the land belonged to the community as much as to my family. Hamish was silent, Margaret continued. My father offered him money. He refused. Then Charles Faircroft threatened him. And afterward Andrew disappeared. Tears filled her eyes. I believed they killed him. You could never prove it. No, and Julian. Margaret looked toward the loch. He wrote saying he had discovered evidence among his father's effects. He tried to blackmail you. He inherited his father's greed. That evening, Hamish invited a handful of people to Black Loch House. Blair arrived first, loudly demanding to know why he had been summoned. I've already solved this case. I'm sure you have, Hamish replied pleasantly. Jimmy Anderson came quietly. So did Margaret, Eleanor, Claire Benson, Mrs. Porter, Malcolm Fraser the gardener. Released after Anderson quietly pointed out there was no evidence against him. And the principal workman. Everyone who mattered was present. Hamish waited until they had gathered in the greenhouse. The room looked exactly as it had on the morning Julian Faircroft's body was found. He held up the length of fishing line. This, he said, is why the murder looked stranger than it really was. Blair snorted. Fishing tackle, aye, Hamish pointed upward. The line ran through the roof, down the iron ring, and outside. He demonstrated, threading it exactly as before. The killer pulled from the garden. Blair frowned despite himself. Why? To overturn the chair and flower pots, after Faircroft was already dead. And why bother? Because they wanted us to believe the struggle happened here. Hamish walked to the rear door. It didn't. It began at the lock. He described the cufflink, the wet sleeve, the footprints, the hidden locket, Andrew Bain's papers, the geological survey, the old police statements placing Andrew near the greenhouse decades earlier. Every clue fitted neatly into place. The greenhouse wasn't chosen by chance, Hamish concluded. It was chosen because 28 years earlier Andrew Bain was last seen here before he vanished. A heavy silence settled over the room. Blair shifted, uneasily. Very touching, he grumbled. But who killed Faircroft? Hamish looked slowly around the faces before stopping on one. Claire Benson? The young secretary went perfectly still. No, she whispered. Hamish's voice remained gentle. You weren't his secretary. You've no proof. You met him before he came to Lockduff. Silence. You knew exactly what was hidden here. Claire's composure cracked. I had to, Hamish continued quietly. Your real name isn't Claire Benson. Margaret stared. Hamish nodded toward the younger woman. Your name is Claire Bain. Margaret gasped softly. Andrew Bain's surname hung in the air like a bell. Claire closed her eyes. My father never drowned? No. Hamish answered for her. He was murdered. Tears rolled silently down Claire's face. My mother told me everything before she died. She looked toward Margaret. She wasn't the woman your father wanted Andrew to marry. Margaret blinked in surprise. Claire gave a sad smile. They had already ended their engagement. Margaret lowered her head. I never knew. My father met someone else after leaving Black Loch. Claire's voice trembled. He planned to expose the fraud before starting a new life, but he disappeared. Claire nodded. My mother believed Charles Faircroft and Alexander McAllister killed him, and she hid Andrew's papers until she died. Claire drew a shaking breath. I found them years later. So you accepted employment with Julian. He advertised for a personal assistant. I recognized the surname. You searched his office. I found letters proving Julian had discovered what his father had done, and instead of going to the police, I wanted him to admit it. She looked toward the floor. He laughed. The room remained utterly silent. He said, murder was ancient history. Her voice hardened. He said, everyone who mattered was already dead. So you arranged to meet him. At the lock, you argued. He admitted his father had taken care of Andrew. Claire's hands began to shake. He said he intended to sell the land anyway. And then I struck him. With what? A boat hook. She covered her face. I didn't mean to kill him. He fell, hit his head. I panicked. She looked at the fishing line above them. My father taught me knots. I remembered the old greenhouse. So you staged the scene. I wanted Charles Faircroft's secret to die with his son. Hamish nodded slowly. And the message? Claire managed a faint, broken smile. I wanted anyone who remembered Andrew to know why. Margaret crossed the room. For a moment, Hamish thought she might strike her. Instead, she embraced her. The younger woman broke into uncontrollable sobs. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. So am I, Margaret replied. So am I? Blair cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, no one paid him much attention. Jimmy Anderson stepped forward quietly. Claire Bain, she turned. I must arrest you for the murder of Julian Faircroft. She offered her hands without resistance. I know. As Anderson led her away, she looked back once. Will people know what happened to my father? Hamish answered simply. Yes, the truth will come out. For the first time since anyone had met her, Claire smiled. It was a small, weary smile, but it was enough. The inquiry that followed uncovered the conspiracy Andrew Bain had died trying to expose. The hidden geological survey, the fraudulent land transactions, and Charles Faircroft's involvement became public record. Although Alexander McAllister had long since died, his reputation did not survive him. Andrew Bain's remains were eventually found beneath a collapsed section of an abandoned quarry, where they had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. Lockduff buried him properly, at last. Margaret stood beside the grave. So did Eleanor. Neither spoke. They no longer needed to. Headquarters, meanwhile, praised the remarkable work of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair accepted every compliment with impressive dignity. I knew from the beginning, he declared to anyone listening, that it was an exceptionally subtle case. Hamish agreed solemnly. It certainly was, sir. Blair beamed. A week later, the official commendation arrived. It bore Blair's name. Hamish regarded it with heartfelt satisfaction. Promotion, once again, had passed him by, exactly as intended. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. The harbour filled with fishing boats. The rain came and went according to its own mysterious schedule. Mrs. Wellington found fresh gossip to replace the old. Angus Macpherson delivered letters while claiming never to read the addresses. One quiet evening, Hamish sat outside the police station with a steaming mug of coffee. Lugs slept at his feet. Across the village, lights glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. There would be more quarrels, more village scandals, almost certainly another murder someday. Human nature guaranteed as much, but for the moment, Lochtabuff belonged once again to the wind, the hills, and the black waters of the loch. Hamish leaned back in his chair. "Aye," he murmured to Lugs, "I think we'll stay exactly where we are." The dog thumped his tail once in contented agreement, and that, Hamish decided, was a very good ending indeed. The weeks that followed settled over Lochtabuff with the quiet certainty of autumn. Tourists arrived, expecting dramatic tales of murder, hidden fortunes, and long-buried secrets. The villagers disappointed them magnificently. "If it was all that exciting," Angus Macpherson would remark while delivering the post, "I'd have remembered it." Mrs. Wellington invariably corrected him. "You've remembered every word, only the important ones." Which meant, by village standards, every word. Black Loch House stood empty once more. The legal proceedings surrounding the estate would take months, perhaps years. The government's discovery of the rare earth deposits ensured that lawyers, surveyors, and civil servants descended upon the district with alarming enthusiasm. Highlanders regarded them with polite suspicion and charged them generously for tea. Hamish avoided them whenever possible. One crisp morning, he found Margaret McAllister standing beside Andrew Bain's grave. The churchyard overlooked the sea, where a fresh breeze carried the scent of salt and heather. "They've cleared my father's name," she said quietly. "They've also cleared Andrew's." Hamish nodded. The truth took its time. It often does. She placed a small bunch of wild Highland flowers against the headstone. "I spent nearly 30 years believing I had failed him." "You didn't. I left. You survived." She looked at Hamish with grateful eyes. "Thank you." He shifted awkwardly. "I'm no much good at speeches." "I wasn't thanking you for speeches," she smiled. "I was thanking you for listening." After she walked away, Hamish remained for another minute, looking at the simple inscription. Andrew Bain had finally come home. A fortnight later, Jimmy Anderson stopped by the police station with a parcel under one arm. "I've something for you. If it's paperwork, take it back." It's better than paperwork. Inside the parcel lay a framed photograph. It showed the restored public footpath winding through the eastern woodland above Black Loch. A brass plaque stood beside the gate. Andrew Bain Memorial Path, dedicated to the belief that some places should belong to everyone. Jimmy grinned. The council voted unanimously. Hamish studied the picture. "I expect Andrew would have liked that." "So do I." At Strathbane Police Headquarters, Detective Chief Inspector Blair was entertaining visitors from headquarters. The commendation for solving the Faircroft murder had earned him considerable praise. Hamish happened to arrive with a routine report, just in time to overhear Blair declaring, "Naturally, I saw through the false leads almost immediately." Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye. Neither man said a word. Some victories were too amusing to spoil. Blair accepted another handshake with immense satisfaction. Hamish quietly left before anyone noticed him. Fresh air was far healthier than official recognition. That evening, Fiona Ross placed a steaming plate of stew in front of Hamish at the hotel. "You've been smiling all day." "Have I? It worries me. I've simply had a pleasant afternoon. No murders, none. No inspectors shouting. Not within hearing distance." She poured him another cup of coffee. Then Lochduff must be back to normal. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft enough to blur the lights reflected in the harbour. Lugs dozed beside the stove, while villagers drifted in and out of the hotel, discussing fishing, weather, sheep, and everything except hidden fortunes. The excitement had already become another Highland story. Hamish tasted the stew, leaned back comfortably, and watched the rain. The Highlands had a way of keeping their secrets until the right person came along. Someone impatient enough to notice what everyone else overlooked. For now, there was no mystery demanding his attention, only good coffee, a warm meal, a faithful dog, and the comforting certainty that despite headquarters' best efforts, he remained exactly where he wished to be. Lochdubuff, once again, was peacefully ordinary. Hamish considered that the finest reward a village policeman could hope for. Winter announced itself with little ceremony. A sharp wind swept down from the hills, carrying the scent of snow across Lochduff. The mountains wore pale crowns of frost, and Black Loch lay dark and still beneath a sky the colour of pewter. It was difficult to imagine that only weeks earlier the quiet shoreline had concealed secrets spanning nearly 3 decades. The village had already moved on. That was one of the peculiar strengths of Highland communities. They mourned sincerely, gossiped enthusiastically, argued cheerfully, and then returned to the practical business of living. The fishing boats continued to leave the harbour before dawn. The church bell rang each Sunday. Mrs. Wellington found entirely new scandals to discuss. Angus Macpherson insisted he never listened to gossip, while somehow knowing all of it before breakfast. Even Black Loch House had begun its slow transformation. Following the government's investigation, the estate was placed into a conservation trust. The public footpaths Andrew Bain had fought to protect remained open, and plans for luxury developments quietly disappeared beneath a mountain of legal documents. "No 1 inches," Lochdubuff complained. One afternoon, Hamish walked the restored woodland path with Lugs trotting happily beside him. The old pines swayed gently overhead. A modest wooden sign stood at the entrance. Andrew Bain Memorial Woodland. Beneath it, someone had carved a simple quotation. "Truth may walk slowly, but it never loses the path." Hamish smiled. It sounded like something Andrew Bain might have appreciated. He suspected the villagers had chosen it together. Margaret McAllister decided not to leave Scotland again. She restored a small cottage overlooking the sea instead of returning to Black Loch House. The great mansion held too many memories, but the Highlands themselves still felt like home. She visited Eleanor often. The sisters spent long afternoons repairing a relationship interrupted by years of silence. Sometimes they spoke about Andrew. Sometimes they simply watched the waves without saying anything at all. Both forms of remembrance mattered. Claire Bain accepted responsibility. For Julian Faircroft's death, the court recognized the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the crime, the decades-old conspiracy, and Julian's attempted blackmail. Justice took its course without forgetting mercy. When Hamish received a brief letter thanking him for uncovering the truth about her father, he folded it carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer. He never mentioned it to anyone. Some gratitude was too private for village conversation. At Strathbane, Detective Chief Inspector Blair received another commendation. He celebrated by reminding everyone within earshot that difficult investigations required exceptional leadership. Jimmy Anderson merely nodded politely later. "Over tea?" he asked Hamish. "Does it bother you?" "What?" That Blair still believes he solved the case. Hamish stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "If believing it makes him happier, I see no reason to interfere. You could claim the credit, I could, and—" Hamish looked out of the cafe window toward the busy street. "I'd rather not spend the rest of my career here." Jimmy laughed. "I thought that might be your answer." The first snowfall arrived late one evening. Lochdubuff grew wonderfully quiet beneath a blanket of white. Hamish lit the stove in the police station, filled the kettle, and settled into his favourite chair. Lug sighed contentedly before falling asleep at his feet. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the glow of the street lamps. The telephone remained silent. No emergencies. No shouting from headquarters. No mysterious outsiders with extravagant plans and expensive coats. Just peace. Hamish lifted his mug. The coffee was hot. The fire crackled softly. His paperwork remained exactly where he intended to ignore it until morning. He reflected, not for the first time, that murder rarely began with evil on a grand scale. More often, it began with pride, greed, jealousy, fear, ordinary failings that grew quietly until someone convinced themselves there was no other choice. Yet the thing that endured longest was never the crime itself. It was the people who refused to forget the truth. Andrew Bain had waited 28 years for justice. He had finally received it. Hamish looked through the window toward the distant outline of Black Loch, now hidden beneath falling snow. The Highlands had kept their secret as long as they could. Now they had taken it back. Lugs opened one eye hopefully. "No," Hamish said with a grin. "It's too late for another walk." The dog settled again with an approving grunt. Hamish leaned back, listening to the wind move gently around the old police station. Tomorrow would bring fresh gossip, fresh complaints, and perhaps someone wanting help with a missing sheep or a wandering cow. It would be an ordinary day. He preferred ordinary days. They were, after all, the very reason he had always worked so hard to remain the apparently lazy constable of Lockdove. Outside, snow continued to fall over the village, the hills, and the dark waters of Black Loch, covering old footprints and beginning new stories. Inside, Hamish Macbeth smiled quietly into his coffee, perfectly content to let the world believe it had all been someone else's cleverness. For him, that was victory enough.